Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the University of Delaware's National Agenda program. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. There's one place where virtually every political development in the nation, in fact, in the world, seems to come home to roost: the White House spokesman. He or she faces daily questioning by reporters from the nation's most prominent news organizations, as well as from reporters from all around the world. The spokesman, standing in front of that White House logo, becomes a familiar face and voice on virtually any issue you can imagine, from U.S. domestic politics to foreign policy, to the role of U.S. troops and covert intelligence operatives, wherever they may be. The spokesman answers questions about Ebola and about the economy, about war-making and peacemaking. And of course, when the White House spokesman speaks, he represents whoever occupies the Oval Office, the president at the time. Our guest speaker tonight is Mike McCurry, who was the White House spokesman for President Bill Clinton during the 1990s. In a soft-spoken voice, Mike answered and dodged questions about terrorism and Iraq, about dictatorships and democracies, about health care, and a million other issues on President Clinton's plate. And famously, or infamously, about President Clinton's affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. But Mike's career is more interesting than that, really. I got to know Mike before he went to the White House, when he was America's diplomatic spokesman at the State Department, where we traveled extensively around the world covering international affairs. And Mike also had been director of communications for the Democratic National Committee in the late 1980s. More recently, amid the polarization of news media and politics in Washington, Mike took refuge from the tumult by earning a Master of Arts degree from Wesley Theological Seminary last year. Today, he teaches at the seminary. Mike's other degrees come from Princeton and Georgetown universities. Just a reminder that we're actually encouraging everyone to use their mobile devices tonight to comment on what you hear. So tweet away, post on Facebook. Don't turn off those phones, but do please silence them. Two more announcements. Don't forget our political film series, Fade to Black, about the dark humor of political feature films, right here in Mitchell Hall. Our next film, and the last one of the season, on December 3rd, is Thank You for Smoking, the 2006 feature about the tobacco industry's political spin on cigarettes and health. You can find more information about the series online at udel.edu/nationalagenda. And our next program, next Wednesday, not 2 weeks from now, but next week, November 19th, is a powerful doubleheader with national political strategist Steve Schmidt, an advisor to Republican campaigns across the country and indeed around the world, and Stephanie Cutter, a former White House advisor to President Obama, who also appears on CNN's Crossfire. That's next Wednesday in this room. Now, please, let's welcome Mike McCurry to the University of Delaware.
Ralph, thank you very much for that introduction. Some of you may be saying that, how does a guy go from working for Bill Clinton to a theological seminary? And there's this thing called the Doctrine of Atonement that I can tell you more about. But it's a pleasure to be here. Ralph also spared you the lengthier bio that I think my office probably sent him, wherein I described my great service for President John Glenn and President Bruce Babbitt and Vice President Lloyd Bentsen. I shared some of these names with the students earlier, and they didn't seem to be familiar with these administrations. President Bob Kerrey, President John Kerry, and I even told them I had gone to Poland to work for Mazowiecki, who ran against Lech Walesa for president of Poland. So thereby establishing you've got an international world-class loser here speaking to you on the subject of politics tonight. So caveat emptor, be very careful of what you buy as you come out of this discussion tonight. But what I'd like to do is a couple things. I want to talk about the election results. We all kind of know, but for some of the students here, since maybe you slept through it, I'll go through some of the results to remind you, as gruesome as it was for those of us who are Democrats. But I also want to unpack some of that and talk a little bit more about the greater challenge that we face in our political culture. This is not a happy country, and certainly not a country happy with its politicians. It was in many ways a dispiriting campaign with a level of nastiness, negativity, and substancelessness that I think really causes great concern as we think about the challenges we face as we look around the world. A country in which more than 2/3 of the people believe that we are headed in the wrong direction, we're on the wrong track, and not headed in the right direction, is a formula that should suggest to those who have been elected and who now return to Washington that they've got some work to do to recover fundamental trust with the American people. So I want to end tonight by talking a little bit about how that might come about, what it might mean as we look ahead to the presidential election of 2016, which, believe me, began about 2 hours ago, if not even sooner. So we'll get into some of that, and Ralph, I look forward to your questions when we're done, and then eventually to your questions too. But first, just a little bit about the landscape and, the context in which we're looking at this election. Obviously, there was a change of leadership in the United States Senate. It wasn't necessarily a surprise, since I think most pundits had predicted that Republicans might gain control of the Senate, but I think what happened and the way it happened was something of a surprise. Democrats were defending a whole bunch of seats, but only 3 in which Barack Obama had won the electoral vote in that state in the 2012 election. And in those 3 states, Democrats lost 2, Colorado and Iowa, and only held on to 1, New Hampshire. Of the other 10 states, which were closely contested, Republicans won all of them, and in all of them, the share of vote in which Barack Obama received in the 2012 election was below 50%. So one way to think about the Senate election is that Republicans, by and large, won the red states, probably not that great a surprise, but Democrats were not successful in holding on to the places where they had a natural advantage. In the House of Representatives, despite the fact that my friend Nancy Pelosi at one point was saying confidently that there would be a chance that Democrats could take back a majority, they did not, and it was now probably true that Republicans in the House of Representatives will have the largest majority they've had since Harry Truman was president, well over 250 seats. Amongst governors, there's now, I think, 32, maybe 31 Republican governors and only 18 Democrats. Republicans were very successful in winning a broad range of state legislative seats, which give them a majority in a lot of states increasingly as states become the laboratory for government, where a lot of issues and ideas and potential public policies are vetted out. That gives Republicans a very strong hand at the state house level. In terms of the electorate itself, a lot has been said about it. I guess the way to summarize it is that it was older, whiter, and righter than the group that voted in the national election in 2012. Just to go through some numbers so we kind of understand who we're talking about here, blacks made up about 12% of the electorate, whites 75%, Hispanics 8%. The interesting thing there is the numbers for minority voters were down from the percentage that voted in the 2012 election, indicating right there why Democrats had some problem. Since we're here on a college campus, the share of vote that represented the 18 to 29-year-old voter went from 19% in 2012 down to about 13%. So they were less of the composition of the total electorate. And in general, the electorate itself was politically on the spectrum more conservative than liberal, and a smaller share of independents than the number of independents who voted in 2012. It was, in long and short, not a very hospitable environment for Democrats to be contesting. And on top of that, not many people paying attention and motivated to vote other than those who were disproportionately inclined to vote Republican. The total turnout was probably around 38%, which is one of the lowest turnouts we've had in the midterm election in many, many cycles. In terms of what the voters were saying and thinking, this is all, by the way, coming out of what the voters tell those who are polling them as they exit from the polls on Election Day. They, by and large and far and away, thought the economy was the most important issue. Over 45% cited that as the top issue on their minds as they voted. 25% mentioned health care. 14% said immigration. By the way, on the health care number, those were folks who were concerned about health care, who were both pro-Obamacare and anti-Obamacare, although they were disproportionately concerned about the President's Affordable Health Care Act. And about 13% cited foreign policy. Given everything happening in the world, particularly in the Mideast, that was a considerably high number for what we usually see in midterm elections. It was a very anxious electorate. 66%, as I said, believe the country is on the wrong track. 64% dissatisfied with the condition of the economy. 72% worried about terrorist attack on U.S. soil. This is an electorate that did not believe that they were seeing in national leadership responses to the things that give them the greatest fear as they sit around and have dinner and supper with their family and friends in the evening. In terms of money, sometimes people say, you know, money is what influences politics, the mother's milk of politics, as the California Assembly Speaker Jess Unruh once said. Really was not that much of an issue. It was pretty evenly spent between the two parties. Republicans probably spent a total in both campaigns and outside expenditures on their behalf about $1.75 billion. On the Democratic side, $1.64 billion, so roughly equal in terms of how much was being spent, and that shook down relatively evenly across all the different kinds of races, House, Senate, party committees, what outside groups were spending collectively. And one comment on this, because people often talk about and complain about the high cost of spending in political campaigns. So I pointed out to the students a little earlier today, we spent total about, with all the expenditures added up, about $3.7 billion on our elections in 2014. By comparison, on Halloween for trick or treat, we spent as a country about $7.4 billion. We spent about $6.4 billion on lawn care. We spend $11.7 billion on dry cleaning. We spend $78 billion on lottery tickets. So in some sense, our politics, maybe even if we don't like it, is something of a bargain in terms of all the money that gets spent. Now, how does it get spent? And here I think is where there are some problems, because it is true that there are special interests that do have a disproportionate impact on the way in which those messages are crafted and how that money is spent. It is largely spent on television advertisements. Over 907,000 television ads aired during the course of this campaign, and they were, in content terms, about as negative and predictable as you can imagine. I would summarize the Republican messages as thus: Obama stinks, Obamacare stinks, government stinks, it can't protect us from Ebola or ISIS or help veterans, the economy stinks due to Democrats and their taxes and spend agenda. That is, by the way, from an outfit called CMAG, a rough substantive condensation of what was on the air during the election. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, the messages were thus: the GOP hates women and they'll ban contraception. Republicans hate seniors, they're going to shred the safety net. Republicans love big business and they're sending our jobs abroad. And the Republicans hate students and they're going to raise your student debt. A summary of what the most often aired commercials were. Not terribly uplifting stuff, if you ask me. Now, one thing, and I think this is always true, that impacts these elections is what people think of the job that the President of the United States is doing in office. And I think that's where Democrats had the hardest case to make, because Republicans tied President Obama around their necks like an anchor. Only 42% of those who voted on Election Day approve of the job the President has done. If you look over the history of recent midterm elections, anytime a president is below 50% in job approval on Election Day, the likelihood is that he is going to lose a considerable number of seats in the midterm election. And just in historic averages, the loss of probably around 20 House seats and 8 or 9 Senate seats by Obama puts him at the slightly high end, but not as high as some have presidents who were in much worse condition when it came to job approval. The electorate is sort of roughly divided, a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a third independent. Those numbers shift up and down a little bit, and that's roughly what it was on election day. So you look at independents who always end up leaning one way or another, and they kind of control what the outcome is. Among independent voters on election day, 54% voted for Republican candidates, 42% for Democratic candidates, and therein, I think, lies much of the story of the election itself. A couple of things that were interesting and maybe a little bit different. In recent elections, when the exit pollsters ask, in general, do you want candidates who will stick to their principles or will compromise if that's what it takes to move forward? In most of our recent elections, stick to principles won by a fairly hefty margin. In 2010, the last midterm election, it was about 57% said they wanted candidates who would stick to principle. 42% said they want people who would compromise. Interestingly, in this election, the number that said they would prefer a compromiser went above 50%, which I think is some comment on the gridlock and the persistent indecision and dysfunction that we have been seeing in Washington. There's a lot more to share in those numbers, but I won't, because I think it's more important to say, what does it all mean at the end of the day? We live, I think, in an era in which my friend Joe Nye, who was the dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, once said, represents an era with a plenitude of information and a paucity of understanding. For all the money spent and all the words uttered and all the campaign ads aired, the conversation we had blew a lot of substance out at the American people, but it didn't organize it in any way for us to make coherent decisions about the future. A lot of these campaigns were kind of sporadic in what they talked about. A lot of what we heard talked about in terms of the coverage in the news of those campaigns was haphazard. A lot of that was dominated by things that kind of came and went. The Ebola crisis, which still is a significant health and economic disaster in Western Africa, but which has now largely subsided from our view as Americans, was the dominant storyline in a large part of the fall campaign. Those things that I think are long-term important in terms of how we are going to do our business as a nation together in addressing the big-ticket questions we had were left largely unaddressed during the course of this election. I reminded some of the students earlier today that when I got out of college and went to work in Washington in 1976, the big issues on the national agenda were the future of our entitlement programs like Social Security. Would they be solvent going into the future? Would promises be kept and payments made? Would our health care system provide insurance that people would have access to doctors and medicine that wouldn't go away or be repealed or taken from them? At the time, Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and he created a Department of Education because there was enormous concern that we weren't educating our kids in a fashion sufficient to make them competitive in a global economy. We lacked a comprehensive energy strategy. Remember Jimmy Carter wearing his little cardigan sweaters in the White House. And we finally had real debate of how we could project our military might around the world in a fashion consistent with our own human rights values on the planet. Now, I ask you, does any of that sound vaguely familiar? Is it true that now a generation later, we are still struggling with those same questions, and we are not having campaigns that kind of take us back to some of those fundamental things that are going to determine what kind of future we're going to have in this country? And you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? Now, part of the blame I think you have to put on the candidates and the rather substanceless campaigns that they ran during the course of this election. There are different and better ways to frame a vision about the future. There are ways in which you can talk about how you will serve the people who are voting to represent their own interests, and how to kind of lift things up that will bring people together in a fashion that is good for the common good of the nation. Very few candidates did that. So I think part of the blame has to go on them. With all due respect to my friend Ralph Begleiter, who's here, some of the blame has to go to the media. Now, my job at the White House was to be kind of their human piñata, so they would whack away, whack away, whack away to see if anything interesting would spill out, which occasionally it did. But, you know, the way in which we cover politics now and the disaggregated nature of content generally, because of social media, the internet, the decline of what we used to call the mainstream media, the ways in which people can, you know, decamp to their own siloed sources of information that correspond to their preconceived views of how things work. I mean, as in, you can go live in, you know, Fox News and read the Washington Times and listen to Rush Limbaugh all day long, or you can go over and read the New York Times and listen to NPR and watch CBS News, and then get two sort of parallel universe discussions about what's happening in this country. The ability to confront contrary information and to ponder it, and then to engage in reasonable civil dialogue with people who might disagree with you, that has been kind of evaporating in our system. And I think when we're here in the auspices of a great university, we have to think about also the role of the academy in provoking and stimulating conversations in which people really do encounter information and ideas that may be contrary to what they thought beforehand. And I think we do too little of that, and I put part of the blame there. But you know, it's tough to let us all off the hook as voters. As I mentioned, only 38% of those eligible voted. In presidential elections now, we rarely get much above 60% of those who are eligible to vote. That primary franchise that on a day like yesterday, Veterans Day, we honor those who have served this nation and preserved to protect that right to vote. The way in which we squander that franchise and don't use it is probably something in which we have to put the blame on all of us. But lastly, I think of this, and this is where I would like to maybe begin our conversation, Ralph, tonight. It comes down to the personal relationships we have with one another. And how do we treat one another, and how do we think about the ways in which we engage with each other as we collectively make decisions as a nation and think about our common good. I think we don't do a particularly good job of that. I think we've become far too facile in criticizing, demeaning, and in a way tearing down those who oppose us, whether it's at the dinner table, in the workplace, or even in the national election. I think those who come together to kind of reason with each other and accommodate each other and really listen and hear each other add to and stimulate the kind of politics that makes a difference. Now, Ralph mentioned that I am now teaching at a seminary, and most faith traditions have some version of a golden rule that says, thou shalt treat thy neighbor as thyself. We don't have a lot of golden rule politics in this country. We've got a lot of negative politics in which candidates say the meanest, sharpest, nastiest things about the opponent that never they would want said about themselves. And now let's think we can find some way to instill that idea of mutual respect and the integrity of conversations that really have authenticity. We're going to keep muddling along the way we muddled along in the last several elections, with no clear consensus about where we go, no real empowerment to those we elect to actually make a difference and change things, and frankly, no real hope that we will restore the idea that makes America great. On that score, and maybe where I will conclude, you know, it is about the vision thing at the end. And I was reading a story about former President George Bush 43's book about his own father, President Bush 41. And remember, President Bush 41 had trouble with that quote-unquote vision thing. But so much of politics really does come down to how do you frame an argument about the future. Of all the blizzard of statistics and exit poll information, the thing that most troubled me about what the voters said on Election Day is that now well over 2/3 of the American public does not agree with the proposition that if I work hard, play by the rules, I'll be able to pass on a better quality of life to my children than the quality of life I enjoy today. That is the fundamental definition of what we used to call the American dream. And now, for most Americans, over 2/3, the American dream is hollow and doesn't represent what they believe is going to be in their own future. That should be, I think, very troubling to a country that prides itself on being exceptional, different, a shining city on the hill, an example to other nations around the world. So I hope we would do one thing, and this is where I will conclude, because it really is about the future. And it is not my idea. It actually comes from a friend of mine, Claire Gaudiana, who is the former president of Connecticut College. But she said, you know, in the year 2026, we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And that will be at the end of presumably the second term of the president that we eventually elect in 2016. It will be as we prepare to elect his or her successor. And wouldn't it be great at that moment in our history as we celebrate that 250th anniversary to be able to say with confidence that we had indeed created a country in which every child born that year had the opportunity to achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not a lofty idea because it would frankly require to be translated into specific policies that would make a huge difference in the way in which children were being brought up, nurtured, and brought into adult life in this country. But I think the best politics in this country have always been those that are built on large aspirational ideas. So in conclusion, I offer that idea up to whoever wants to run for president in 2016. Why don't we say something about that fundamental declaration that we made together as Americans so long ago, that together we will create a country in which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is in fact real for every single one of us. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Before we get going, I have to tell you one Ralph Begleiter story.
Uh-oh.
Of which there could be many, but you know, he was, when I first went to the State Department, and I was a rookie diplomatic spokesman, very, very nervous about that occasion. I stood up in my very first briefing to announce that our Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, was going off on a tour of Central Asia. And I said he was going to visit Armenia and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then I listed some other countries. Mr. Begleiter, sitting in the back, said, Mike, did you just say the Deputy Secretary was going to Kurdistan? And I looked at you and I said, yes, Kyrgyzstan, I just said. And we were talking past each other. He was asking me if I had just recognized a new nation that had heretofore not existed, Kurdistan, which is very much in the news. I was actually Kyrgyzstan. And I learned then the value of accurate pronunciation at the White House. But really, we come from an age in which amicability was the definition of this adversarial relationship between the press and those in public life in places like the White House. And I think a lot of that has left the system. And that amicability and the ability we had to work together is something that's been sorely missing.
Well, I think you called it adversarial, and I think there's a big difference between adversarial and what you were just talking about, which is people ready to tear down rather than accomplish solutions. Adversarial is, holding people to the feet to the fire, and that goes for the media as well.
Yeah, but I think the tonal quality of that adversarial relationship between the press and those who have got political authority can also be an amicable one. I mean, it's adversarial because you're speaking truth to power and insisting on accountability, but I, on my side, should be respecting that important aspect that the Fourth Estate plays, and you don't see a lot of that nowadays. There's too much crushing out of contrary opinion, and people not willing to work with those who've got a legitimate interest in reporting on what's happening to the American people. I think that's a problem. It's probably one of the things that is part of the dysfunction I talked about.
I was struck by you mentioned a number of statistics, but I was struck by a combination that you didn't put all together, but in the end comes together. You said 3/4 of the American people, or 2/3 of the American people think the country's on the wrong track. 2/3 of the American people have lost belief that their children will have a better life or as good a life as they've had, and 2/3 of the people didn't vote. And I have a hard time reconciling those things. If we're so discontent with our society, with our potential for the future, why are we also discontent or ignoring the opportunity to do something about it?
Well, I think because for many Americans, they feel burned. I think there are several answers to your question. It would be ironic for me to quote Sarah Palin.
It would be, but go ahead.
You know, she had this mocking way of saying about President Obama and to people who supported President Obama, well, how do you think that changey, hopey thing has worked out for you? And what she meant by that is that, you know, she was calling into question whether or not people feel that that change of direction, that enthusiastic response we had in 2008 had been fulfilled by a president who now largely the American people disapprove of in terms of how he's doing his job. So I think that's part of it. I think it's a sense of disappointment that we thought we were going to get so much better and we didn't. I think that's part of it. I also think that structurally we put a lot of barriers in the way of people when it comes to voting. We haven't made it easier. The New York Times has an interesting editorial today that goes through this. In states that had mail-in ballots or early voting, or basically made it considerably easier for people to vote, turnout was much higher than it was in the national average. There are places where, quite frankly, Republicans create barriers because they want to see fewer people in that new American majority, which is, you know, composed of minority voters, younger voters, in many cases female voters, but a part of what was the Obama coalition in 2008, 2012, they've actually made it hard in some cases for people like that to gain access to the ballot. So I think there are structural impediments, but I think fundamentally it's a sense of disappointment in that I keep voting and I don't seem to get any of those things that I voted for. And I think that feeling is pretty deep in many Americans.
Speaking of disappointment, how would you assess how much of the outcome of this election you would attribute to the President of the United States himself, how much you would attribute to economic circumstances or geopolitical ones, the war on ISIS, the Ebola crisis, and things like that?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's obviously all of the above. How would you weight those factors? You know, despite what the White House has said, I think people were, at least we know, at least a third of those who voted said they really did want to send some kind of message to President Obama about their dissatisfaction. And they recorded that in some of the exit polling that we saw. And I think even though he wasn't on the ballot, he did suggest at one point during the campaign that his policies were on the ballot. So he opened the door to the judgment that he was, you know, part of this was a verdict on his own leadership. But I do think people get their sense of momentum and where the country is headed, whether we are, you know, going the right direction or on the wrong track, from the leadership we get from the president and his use of the bully pulpit. And I think the president has had so many enormous challenges, and you mentioned some of them, what's happening in Iraq and Syria and other things on the national agenda. I think it was very hard for him to galvanize that tool of the bully pulpit and use it effectively. Boy, was that said cautiously. But you get the point.
Okay, I think you got the point. I want to ask you about the media environment again, because you mentioned that earlier, and you talked about people, consumers of media information, you said decamping to their silos. And what we've seen happen in the last 10 or perhaps 15 years, let's say, is the creation of those media silos. And you talked about a little bit of that. But my question is do you see a prospect for reversing the silification of our information environment, not just in the political sphere particularly, but maybe in a whole variety of spheres? I mean, I always say to students, almost everything is politics, but there are some areas where people would say, oh, that's not politics, but you still have silos.
Yeah, I do see change that will happen, and I am optimistic about, for example, the profession of journalism. I think it's taking hard knocks now because we are going through a period in which all of the economic models of the news business are being radically revamped, and circulation figures are down for daily newspapers. It turns out, you know, looking at the young people down here, they don't really read ink on paper anymore because they get all their information electronically. And yet we've got major news enterprises that still believe they're in the business of putting, you know, a chunk of paper on your driveway every morning. So that world is changing, and I don't think it's changed fast enough. We see some of that in electronic media as the audiences splinter out across all the different places on the internet. Broadcast media has not found ways to kind of attract back and hold coherent the sort of audience that we had when Walter Cronkite was pronouncing, "That's the way it is." You know, we don't have that common campfire that we gather around every night where we are able to talk about things going on in the country and get on the same page together. Now, what will change and why am I optimistic? I think there's a model about to be born of places on the web where people who know they're getting spasms of information and sometimes urban myths that may or may not be true. They know that they're going to have to go to some place that is kind of the place that is rock bottom credible, and that they know absolutely will have the truth and the accurate information that they seek if they're trying to settle a dispute at the dinner table or if they're trying to understand something that they've heard about or wonder about. Now, that used to be venerable organizations like the New York Times. We were talking about that earlier today. It hasn't been born yet. I don't know, maybe...
Who's going to pay for it?
Well, maybe Google will buy the New York Times. I mean, it'll be the Google Times, who knows? But something like that will happen. There'll be a radical reconstruction of the economics of the news business, and we, as consumers who value content, will have to get accustomed to the idea that not everything is free. I think the problem is, among journalistic enterprises, we allowed the idea to slip out of the barn that, you know, all content was free on the internet. And then that, of course, left great journalists and good news organizations with no budgets to pay for what it takes to go out and report the news. So I think we have to go back and recapture some of that. And we've done it, you know, we've done it in entertainment. My kids now, I make them, you know, pay on iTunes, at least according to my Visa card, they pay every month. But I make them buy their music rather than just, you know, lifting it off for free from the internet or, you know, frankly, robbing the creators. And I think we're going to have to move to some model in journalism like that, too.
I want to ask you about, you lamented the environment of campaign styles. You talked about negative campaign ads, 900,000 ads, and so on. I want to ask you about that environment in the same way as I just did about the media. Is there anything that you see in the future that is going to improve that environment, turn it in another direction? And I'll just mention one aspect that you didn't talk about. It seems that a lot of the incentives for campaign environments are actually moving in the opposite direction. Redistricting has become a tool whereby the vast majority of offices up for election are, you know, no brainers, not toss-ups. They're not even contested in the election. So smaller and smaller portions of the country become focused on in the campaign. You have candidates who have discovered that negative advertising works, and sending it out on the web makes it viral. What's going to turn that around in the campaigning environment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that, and it is commonly said in politics, well, there's so many negative ads because they quote unquote work. And by that they mean that they usually are sharp and visceral, and the voter can retain that information longer than something that is loftier and more inspirational and more positive. I challenge that. I think a candidate who comes and addresses these fundamental things that I tried to lift up, what's happened to the American dream, what are we really doing to improve the quality of kids in this country, and who speak practically and precisely about what they're going to do about it. So not just vague generalities. I think a candidate like that can inspire. Now, what will also change that is if we, the people, rise up in some reaction to this. I mean, we can't, there has to be some penalty for people who are constantly using bitterness and poison and sulfur to pollute our political environment. We don't take it out on them at the ballot box always because
We don't even vote.
we don't vote, and we don't make them pay any price in terms of how we rate them when we get asked if we approve of their job performance or not. And I think that's shame on us. I mean, I do think there has to be some counter reaction to that. But it's not, again, and it's not just redistricting, because you could eliminate all gerrymandering, and I think you'd still have a composition of Congress that was largely favoring current incumbents in office. Now, why is that? It's because of the patterns in which we are living in our neighborhoods now. We are living in more homogeneous communities. We tend to move to places and congregate with people that we feel some affinity for. The diversity and complexity of neighborhoods that used to exist in this country is subsiding. And so our patterns of living are changing. So what we need, and this is, I have reflected a little bit with you, and what am I really actually doing in the work I do at Wesley Seminary. Now, I personally believe the church and the church as an establishment and religious people together who profess to believe in some community of common good in which we do love our neighbor. That has some bearing on how we come together to deal with these contentious, difficult issues that divide the body politic. Because in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our churches, on any given day of the week, when we gather together, we sit in pews together with people who do have different points of view on political issues. And yet, in most places of worship, the pastors, the rabbis, the imams run the other direction because they don't want to offend the audience by talking about politics. Well, I think we got to break that down. I mean, I'm not arguing for theocracy. I think we've seen too many examples of religion being used in a negative way in politics. But I do think if you believe in a golden rule approach to politics, churches can be places where we have more considered, thoughtful, loving conversations about our future that would break down some of this division. It's a hopeful aspiration, and I know there have got to be people out there that say that's nuts, and maybe it is, but it's worth, since nothing else is working, it's worth trying.
We're going to take questions from the audience here in a second, but I can't let you go without asking you to look ahead to the 2016 election campaign, which, as you said, began yesterday or a couple of hours ago. Give us your spin first on the Democratic Party. How do you see it unfolding over the next 2 years? And then I'll ask you the same thing about the Republicans.
I knew I wouldn't get out of here without getting the Hillary question.
I have nothing for you on that.
The Hillary question, the Monica question, and the question about any other women in my life, probably. But I agree with the proposition that Mrs. Clinton is the most formidable figure within the Democratic field. I think the election results last week increased the intensity of pressure on her to make clear that she's the one who will stand up and carry the Democratic banner forward because everyone's despondent. Republican Congress and a Republican president, many Democrats feel, would turn back a lot of things that they consider progress made over the last 20 years or so. So the pressure on her to run is considerable. Now, against that is the fact she's a grandmother now. It's nasty business. She's currently, because of the work she's doing in her foundation, up here on a pedestal and loving the work she's doing. She gets to work with her husband, her daughter. They're doing some amazing things at the Clinton Foundation. And she'd have to give that all up to go crawl around the coffee shops of Manchester, New Hampshire, and Des Moines, Iowa for 2 years. That's not as fun as going around and being a global statesperson. So I honestly believe that she is still wrestling with the decision on whether to run. And I probably am the last person in Washington that hasn't concluded it's a foregone conclusion that she's running. But I think she has to weigh it because it's not going to be an easy path to the nomination. As sure as we're sitting here right now, because this is always true, 35% of those who vote in the Iowa caucus will vote against a frontrunner, just on the sheer principle of wanting to be contrary. And that then opens up someone, I don't know, Martin O'Malley, my governor in Maryland, I don't know, someone else, who would step in and begin to make a case that maybe we don't have to accept the inevitability of Hillary Clinton. Now, consider who else that might be. What about someone who's run the 11th largest economy in the world, someone who just got reelected with 58% of the vote, someone who appeals to young people, extraordinary despite his own considerable number of years, someone who, has demonstrated the ability to get Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature to work together.
California governor?
A California governor. So Jerry Brown.
Okay.
Now, I say that because my very first campaign that I worked on as a kid at Princeton was for Jerry Brown. When I had been promised a job working for the Washington Post, which owned the newspaper in Trenton, New Jersey, and then the Washington Post decided to sell the paper, so there I was graduating from Princeton with no prospect for a job. And as I always say, it wasn't the last time I got screwed by the Washington Post either. So, but anyhow, along came in that year my governor, Jerry Brown. I was from California, and he was an awful lot of fun to campaign with. It was my very first campaign.
So you might have been a journalist?
I was intending to be a journalist, working for what was then the Farm Club for the Washington Post. And I was going to then be the next Bob Woodward and go work at the Washington Post. But I got cured of that by an editor named Dick Harwood, who you probably knew. And then, it goes without saying, and I probably should have said it first, given that I'm sitting here in the great state of Delaware, there's a vice president of the United States who's accomplished a great deal, who I think would be sitting there and very interested in running too, should Mrs. Clinton decide not to run.
How about the Republicans?
Well, that's where to begin. There are, at last count, 24 names on the great mentioner has placed on the list of those running. And I will not go through all 24 because the night would go on forever. But they fall into three categories, and I think there are going to be three primaries. And this will be interesting. There'll be a kind of a Tea Party primary to pick the most, anti-government libertarian of the Republican candidates, who could very well be Rand Paul. So there'll be kind of a contest in that segment. There'll be a social conservative primary. This is, who appeals most to the Christian evangelical conservatives who are very prominent in Iowa. In fact, they probably run the Republican Party in Iowa. So that's a very important segment of the Republican primary vote. And you've got guys like Santorum who are running, maybe Mike Huckabee from Arkansas would run. And then you have a more traditional mainstream kind of Chamber of Commerce Republican primary in which someone like Jeb Bush emerges, or Robert Portman from Ohio. I mean, other people who are kind of, John Kasich from Ohio has been mentioned recently, so they're kind of a more traditional. Mitt Romney, I doubt it, because I think there are other characters who could attract that element of that vote, and they wouldn't need to turn back to Romney again. But they'll emerge, what I'm saying is, there'll be kind of three different profiles of candidates that emerge, and then they'll slug it out for a nomination, and we'll see what happens. But as we sit here today, I find it hard to imagine that the American people want to see, in this very anti-establishment age, when the electorate is so angry and so disappointed in leadership, hard to imagine they want to see another Bush versus Clinton presidential campaign, irrespective of how qualified both of them are, and I stipulate that about Mrs. Clinton. But, it just doesn't feel like that's where a country wants to go as we think ahead and look down into the 21st century.
All right, let's take your questions. We'll alternate between students and non-students. Let's start with a non-student tonight. Raise your hand, please, if you have a question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if one of the factors that plays into what you've been talking
Yeah.
And if you would agree with that, should we not be looking at a national service requirement like what Andrew basically suggested?
Okay, question is, I just need to paraphrase. The question is, we've always looked at our national rights and we've failed to look at our national responsibilities. The question for you is, what about some sort of a national service requirement in the United States?
Well, I think it's a very well stated question and kind of consistent with what I was trying to describe. Very Clintonian in some ways, because Bill Clinton, if you think back to 1992, did talk about we need a country with opportunity for the individual, but responsibility from the individual to work for community and for the common good. I mean, it was a very simple formula, but it traced out in a lot of different things that he talked about, including a program for national service that became eventually AmeriCorps. Can we institute a national policy of national service? Not likely mandatory, but I do think we have got some momentum now behind the idea that young people, before they march off to college or go into the workforce, can give a year back to the country in some form of service. Peace Corps, community work, AmeriCorps, teaching, Teach for America, a whole different variety of opportunities that are out there. What the problem is the capacity of the volunteer sector to absorb that many bodies. What do you actually do with them? Because we don't want them running off and wasting time. We want them to do things productive if they're going to serve the country. You know, what kind of exemptions that there have to be and need to be for people who are doing other things or taking care of families or the sole economic provider for a family. There have to be some exemptions. But I'll tell you, there's a great group working on this, and one of them is a guy that I've come to admire a lot, General Stanley McChrystal. He's working on that with a number of other groups, some that I just mentioned, and they are going to do a campaign for national service that will, you know, not require young people to do it, but make it so much a part of who we are as Americans that it's expected of you that everyone, you know, the young people who are here today start talking about where you're going to do your service year. What are you going to do for your service year? It's like you know, I've got college-age kids. It's very customary for kids to go abroad. You know, where are you going to do your junior year abroad? But we want to make that question, where are you going to go do your service, and make that just part of what happens in the normal course of life for a young adult.
How about a question from a student?
Who will probably throw tomatoes at me for what I just talked about.
Question from a student. Am I missing a hand? Okay, go ahead. Okay, questions about the, it's a media-related question about the dumbing down of information to the American people. The question is, what do you think about the role of the media in shaping the political dialogue?
I think some media is not blanket true across the board, does not treat us with the respect we deserve, because I think we are capable of understanding complex things. I think they don't always take the time, space, and energy to make complicated things interesting to us. But I also think we have a culture of public relations and politics and political communications that does try to dumb down information. I mean, if any of you have suffered through a thing called media training, one of the things that people, some media trainers use the formula KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And that's not right, because when we're talking about a lot of these issues, whether it's, you know, entitlement reform or education or how we're going to be more competitive in the global economy or how we're going to institute, you know, a real comprehensive energy policy, we're talking about enormously complex subjects. But I think we could handle that if we sustain our attention over time. The problem is, and this is my criticism of journalism, is they are in the business of news. And you ask a journalist, well, why don't you kind of keep coming back to this stuff that's important? And they say, well, because we already told that story. We already did that piece. We already had that on the news. And, you know, for me, as someone who works in communications, you have to remind them it's the repetition. It's the over and over quality that really allows things to sink in. So it's not dumbing it down, it's repeating it so that it actually begins to crystallize and people begin to think, well, how are they going to act on the information that they get? And I think that's something different than what the journalist offers up and what most news organizations offer up. But I think there's a whole lot about the news business as a business that needs to change if they're going to survive.
I'm going to follow up on that and challenge you just a bit on that. You said the news media are in the business of news. I think with short form media that we're seeing increasingly through the social media especially, Twitter and Facebook are the examples, but Reddit and a whole bunch of others, Instagram and so on, are all examples of it. It seems to me that what the business is in the business of is eyeballs. If we can make something viral, that's good. Whether it's true or not doesn't seem to matter very much. It's just viral.
Well, this is a common complaint. It's just about entertainment, or it's infotainment. But I have no problem with entertaining consumers of information if it's important information. I mean, I have no problem with mixing entertainment value with true information. I mean, we were talking at dinner about, people who are good at moderating debates or bringing information in, and you ask any college audience, who do you think is really giving you interesting content, and Jon Stewart's name comes up, even though he's clearly an entertainer. But, he does package up information that for a lot of young people they wouldn't otherwise hear because they get some of it at least in that format. We had, when Clinton was president, I remember we got into a big controversy, and ABC took the brunt of this because we were going to have, one of the actors, the hottie from Titanic, Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah.
You can see how big I am on popular culture. Anyhow, we were going to have him interview Bill Clinton about global warming and he's knowledgeable, he's a smart guy. And they were going to have a conversation about it, and ABC was going to air it. And then ABC got hammered within the journalistic world for doing such a dreadful thing, bringing entertainers in to interview the President of the United States. My God, how could anyone do that? Well, people would have actually watched that, and they would have gotten some information from it. It would have been useful information. So I have no problem with it. I think the format is not the important thing, it's the content.
Okay. We, as you know, we live stream this over something called Second Life, and there's an audience out there that's watching us, and we have a question from Puerto Rico, which is asking whether the United States is really ready anytime soon to have a woman as its president.
Yes. Manifestly, obviously, yes. And maybe not necessarily Mrs. Clinton, although she would be, in my opinion, a good choice for that. But are we ready for it? Yeah, I think we have broken that glass ceiling. It's just a question of who can actually compete for the office and achieve it.
Okay. Question from a non-student. Non-student? Am I missing a hand? Yes, sir.
No, I did try to mention that a little bit.
Well, let me just paraphrase the question. The gentleman is asking about, he said you didn't mention the money that was spent. You talked quite a bit about the money that was spent, but the root of the question is about whether the money fosters a corrosive atmosphere,
Yeah.
and you didn't.
I didn't talk about how the money was spent as much as maybe I should have, but my general point is at $3.7 billion spent compared to a whole set of other expenditures, that is not not an obscene amount for us to spend thinking about and measuring and evaluating the candidates. Now, the problem is it is spent in a way that I think drives us away from coherent debates because it's spent on these awful 30-second television ads. And I really question the utility of those in an age in which people are not showing up for appointment television at a certain time because you can bleep those commercials out, you can skip over them. You don't need it if you are YouTubing a show that you enjoy watching, and you can skip through the ads that are on the internet. I think it, frankly, is a bunch of people who are my age, who are political consultants, who make an awful lot of money making those commercials, and they get to, by the way, they get, as part of their payment, a portion of the money spent on ads is their compensation. So they get like 15% of the quote-unquote buy for the commercials is their compensation for making the commercials. They have a vested interest in putting these campaign commercials together, and I think they are disproportionately negative, and especially the groups from outside, not just the candidate's own campaign, but those outside groups that are largely operating in the dark now because we don't know who gives the money to those organizations. They put a lot of the negative ads on. So I do think it does have some of that corrosive effect. But again, I personally think strong, visionary, positive messages can override a lot of that negativity. But it's not the money, to answer your question, that matters. I just don't think that, because I think, first of all, both sides have roughly equal sums of money. There's not any disparity there. It just needs to be spent better to engage the American public.
Question from a student? Is there a question from a student? Back there, yes?
Hi, you talked a lot about voter turnout, and I know that Australia has a ticketing fee if you don't show up to polls. Do you think that would work in the U.S. or kind of compete?
Okay, question is about low turnout, and the questioner is asking whether having some kind of a fee, we wouldn't want to call it a tax, of course, for not voting, might have an effect on turnout.
Yeah, or it'd be like a ticket. You'd get a ticket for not voting. Look, I don't think you can coerce people in the vote. It's an honor to be able to vote. And I think we need to treat it as such. But I think it starts with doing a better job of teaching something that's largely absent from our K through 12 curriculum now, which is civics. There used to be, all the older folks here remember, we used to have a thing called civics, and you would learn about citizenship and learn about the responsibility to vote and learn why that was important. But I think because of controversy in public schools, teachers, administrators now flee from that topic. They do social studies, but they do it in such a, amorphous way that you don't really get the idea that why is it that it is important to vote, because they don't want to do anything that looks like they're crossing some line politically. So I think the answer is more in how can we lift up and enhance young people's understanding of citizenship so that they begin the pattern of voting and become more reliable as voters. Remember that as you move up through life, this becomes more important to you, and so you vote more regularly. So voting participation rates among the over age 50 category are obviously much higher than they are below age 50, and of course they're lowest among those who are mobile and not necessarily in one place, particularly college-age kids. So the 18 to 29 turnout is the lowest of all. I think we can combat that by getting people more excited and interested with better candidates. I mean, that's probably a good place to start. And then there are programs. I happen to be active in a program called the Junior Statesman Program. It's more prevalent out in California in the West than it is here on the East Coast. And it's a great program that gets young people off to conventions, hearing speakers, learning about citizenship and democracy. They run their own governments and conventions and things like that. And it makes a difference. It just doesn't reach enough people to have the kind of impact that we would like.
I want to come back for just a second. Something occurred to me while you were speaking. About 2 years ago, after the 2012 presidential election, Democrats sitting on this stage here and in the national media all basically accused the Republicans of having drunk the Kool-Aid. They were following their own media. They thought they were going to win, and they believed somehow that the results that were coming in, even up until the very last minute on election night, weren't going to be true, and that somehow Mitt Romney would win the presidency. Is it fair to say this year that in some respects the Democrats drank that same Kool-Aid and they thought up to the last minute, well, it's not going to be so bad, we'll hold on to some seats, we may be able to hold on to the majority? What do you think about that?
I think there was some element of denial that this awful angry, grumbling electorate would turn against the president's party in the fashion that it did. There was some suspension of belief around that. By the way, when you were just describing it, I started thinking, is he talking about 2004? Because I remember I was on John Kerry's campaign in 2004, and we had I remember dancing with Stephanie Cutter, you can ask her about this, she'll be here at this program next week. And we were dancing in the last night of the campaign and the last rally as John Kerry croaked his way to the finish line because he lost his voice. And we were having a dance, having a great time because we were absolutely certain that we were going to win the next day. And you talk to friends who worked on Al Gore's campaign in 2000, they were absolutely sure that they were going to win. Of course, he did. But that's another story for another day. Yeah, no, I think part of that is you work so hard in these campaigns and you give it your all, you want to believe that it's going to turn out okay. I'll tell you one interesting little story. This was in the Washington Post today, so it may not have circulated up here. Mark Warner's campaign in Virginia.
What do you think we are, backwater here?
No, I know. No, that was more a comment
We're
on
2 states away.
That was a comment on the circulation department at the Washington Post.
Okay, gotcha.
Anyhow, they had Warner, as you know, ran a very tight race against Ed Gillespie. By the way, that campaign, even though it did have its negativity.
Back up here. We're talking about Virginia Senate race.
I'm sorry, the Virginia U.S. Senate race between the incumbent Mark Warner and the former chairman of the Republican Party,
Ed Gillespie.
A guy named Ed Gillespie. 2 really quality guys. I know both of them personally, think very highly of both of them. Sorry that not both of them could end up serving in the United States Senate because one had to win and one had to lose, although Gillespie came very close to upsetting Warner. And they ran the kind of campaign that I think is contrary to a lot of what I talked about as the general condition of politics here. It was by and large very positive. Gillespie had a very positive message, talked a lot about how he would work to create jobs throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, but he ran out of money at the end. And they had to scrape together all of their money to put in one last batch of television ads, so they didn't have money to poll in the race, and they did not know what Mark Warner's campaign knew, since they had a lot of money, that it was getting very, very close, and that Gillespie was closing the margin down to within 2 or 3 percentage points. This was by the way, one of the closest contested Senate elections in the country on election night. So the Warner people had to make a judgment. Do we put out the word that we really are hurting here and we need an infusion of money and we need some help? Or if we did that, would we alert Republican donors that Gillespie's got a chance and give him the opportunity to go out and raise money? And they elected to keep quiet and hide the fact that it was getting quiet. It was a very calculated gamble, and it almost did not work for them because they did not get support from the Senate Campaign Committee and any of the other institutional parts of the Democratic Party at the end, because no one figured he was in trouble. The money was going to places like North Carolina for Kay Hagan or up to New Hampshire for Jeanne Shaheen and some of the other Democratic candidates. Very, very interesting.
Question from a non-student. No, not right now, thanks. Go ahead, yes.
When you were talking about potential presidential candidates for the next election, you mentioned one of our alums, Joe Biden, but you didn't mention another prominent one, Chris Christie. And I'm wondering if you think that he's too rough around the edges for the Chamber of Commerce segment of the Republican Party. Is that why you didn't mention it?
All right, so the question's about Chris Christie's prospects for running for the presidency in 2016.
Yeah, it's interesting. If in those 3 buckets that I mentioned, he clearly doesn't fall in the Tea Party bucket, clearly not the social conservative bucket. And I think among establishment Republicans who kind of go for the Mitt Romney look, he ain't that. But there's an authenticity to him and kind of this quality that I think is freshly appealing to a lot of people. And I think he's had his miscues along the way, but every presidential candidate has to deal with some things not turning out well. And he worked harder than arguably any other Republican wannabe in this election and going out and campaigning on behalf of candidates who are out there. So I think I didn't mean to exclude him from the list. I just didn't go through the entire list.
Do you think Bridgegate is behind him?
Yeah. I think, it's just like in Maryland where I live, people are saying, well, the fact that Democrats, even though there's 2-to-1 registration margin in favor of Democrats in Maryland, Anthony Brown, the Democratic candidate handpicked by Martin O'Malley, didn't win. Won't that destroy Martin O'Malley's chances to run for the Democratic presidential nomination? And the answer is no, because nobody will remember it, 90 days from now. And I think largely the same is true of Christie.
You realize it's going to be very difficult for University of Delaware voters
if it's a
Biden-Christie race. And I personally am hoping we have the debate right on this stage. I'm just saying.
What are the chances, what are the chances of that?
Talk about a Subway series, right?
Yeah. By the way, I did not mention.
I was going to actually mention, no, you didn't. Let me just throw a biographical detail out to you here because of something Mike wants to talk about here. Among the many things that Mike does, but one he didn't mention tonight, is he is a member of the Presidential Debates Commission. That's the organization that every 4 years in presidential years organizes those formal debates among the candidates for President of the United States and the one debate for the Vice President.
Right.
You wanted to talk about that?
I was just thinking, why not have it here at the University of Delaware?
Why not indeed?
It is.
Why not indeed?
That's a little bit of a tease because I think the provost has left now, so he won't fall over dead when I tell you. One of the challenges to hosting these events is that the host institution has to raise a lot of money. We don't have any money. We don't get funding from Congress. We can barely scratch 2 nickels together. It's just as an independent commission that comes together to kind of structure and put together the debates. So the host institution ends up having to raise a lot of the money to do the infrastructure, the facilities. It's unbelievable. You got to import, all kinds of air conditioning and all sorts of other things so the candidates don't sweat during the debate. So it's a very expensive proposition. And for many schools and universities, particularly publicly financed institutions, it just ends up being hard to justify spending the money on that when you got so many other urgent needs. Now, for some schools, that's why we've been to Hofstra, Center College, Lynn University, places that are small colleges that frankly branded themselves by becoming a place in which these debates were held. Washington University in St. Louis, which is a fine institution, has really, they almost tripled their volume of applications from having been a regular sponsor of the debates. So for them, it has worked out to be a very good proposition. But I think this fine institution's got so much going for it, I'm not sure they need a presidential debate.
All right. I'm going to take another question from Second Life. This one's coming from Maryland, your home state. It's noting that President Obama came out the other day, a couple days ago, in favor of net neutrality. And the questioner is asking, why do you think the president did not make that a campaign issue by talking about it before the election rather than waiting till after the election?
Because nobody really knows what it is. Everybody thinks they know.
These are people on Second Life asking
right.
this question,
Everybody thinks they know what net neutrality is, but it is very, very difficult to explain. Now, to his credit, when President Obama addressed it the other day, he did make it pretty simple. He said, the internet is just as important to us as water and electricity. And so the government should regulate the internet just like it regulates water and electricity. We ought to have, it's called Title II authority under the Federal Communications Act, but basically it's the federal government ought to step in to make sure that the internet does not favor any one group of users or content providers or network providers over others by keeping everything working on the internet at not necessarily the same speed, but equal access to everyone who needs access to the internet to deliver content.
But you're saying that he didn't do it before the election because he would have had to explain it more thoroughly and there would have been a debate over something most people have no idea what it is.
Right. It would have taken so much time and effort away from, I mean, I gave you the number, 45% said the economy was the biggest issue. And I guess you could have shoehorned that in there and said the free, open access to the internet is a key component part of economic growth, and that's why we have to have the federal government has to make sure it preserves the free, open internet. But I have a checkered history on that issue because I'm on the other side of that issue. I should, full disclosure on that. And I think he was addressing this in part because he was sending a signal to the Independent Federal Communications Commission that this is what he would prefer to see the FCC do as it does rulemaking around this question. But it is a very, very complicated question because once you step in and say we're going to regulate the internet just like we regulate utilities, electric utilities, then why not regulate their rates? Although Obama said specifically, no, I'm not talking about rate regulation, but it's not clear once you invoke Title II as your authority to regulate the internet. I'm getting way down in the weeds here. It's not clear you can regulate the internet without doing all of it. It would require what's called forbearance at the FCC, and I think that is a very, very tricky thing. I think that'd be hard to do.
Let's take a question from a student. Is there a question from a student?
This, by the way, is a very popular, it is a popular issue among young people and internet users.
But none of them asked about it.
Yeah, well, someone in.
Yeah, okay. Question from a student? Yes, sir.
Hi, how are you? What do you think the impact of being a Washington insider or Washington outsider will have, especially in the Republican primaries where you see Republican governors coming to prominence like Dr. Jindal and especially led by Chris Christie? What do you think that impact will be in the
Okay, so the question is, in the Republican primaries especially, how much of an impact on the campaign will it be whether a candidate is a Washington insider or someone coming to the campaign from outside D.C.?
Yeah, you may have gathered when I went through what people think of the current condition of politics in Washington, that Washington insider is not what you would put on your bumper strip if you were running for president, because the advantage will go to people who are outside the establishment, outside Washington, can't be tied to kind of all the things that people think have gone wrong in Washington over the last 20 years. Which again, as much as I am deeply supportive of Mrs. Clinton, that is a challenge for her because she has to kind of overcome some of that. I think on the Republican side, and you mentioned some of the likely candidates, they've got a bigger supply of people who are not traditional Washington figures. For example, you know, they don't have prominent senator, well, I see with the exception of Rand Paul and Cruz and Marco Rubio, who are outside the establishment in the Senate. They don't have people who are kind of longtime Washington figures who are lining up to run. They're drawing on a pool of people more from the outside, and history suggests that those are folks who do, you know, have a better chance. It's also why I think historically governors have a better chance of being elected president than senators or congressmen.
Playing devil's advocate there, though, we've just come through, we've got 6 years under our belts of a president who came as and campaigned as a non-insider, and the American people, at least at the moment anyway, would be concluding, well, that didn't work out so well, not that much got done in D.C., so it would be possible to make the argument that the outsider Washington syndrome is not necessarily a positive.
Yeah, I think it's a little different than that. I think there still is preference for people who are not creatures of Washington, but there probably will be a higher premium on demonstrated competence and the ability to deliver the change that you're promising. I think there will be an added credential or hurdle that a candidate will have to cross on with that respect. So a fresh
Gives governors an
yeah,
advantage.
this is why a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio who don't have a track record of actually having run things, I think would have a very tough time getting elected.
Question from a non-student. All right, I'm going to go back over here. I don't see any on the left. So, yeah, go ahead. I can't see you, but go ahead.
The Republicans seem to be able to say just about anything and it sticks. They can say the worst lie and you believe it. Yet the Democrats have some wonderful accomplishments that we've seen through these years, and they can't get anybody. They could have a fistful of $100 bills and can't give them away. What is the problem with the Democratic Party on selling their message to the American public so they can see the
Okay, I'll leave out the preface to the question and just ask, is there a problem that Democrats have as compared to Republicans in selling their message and convincing people they have a convincing message?
It's a good question, and I'm going to give you a very generalistic answer. Because, and by the way, the premise of your question is an important one. If you step back and look at, what Barack Obama has achieved in office, what, job growth, what he's done in terms of economic growth, a whole range of indicators that are out there, it is a lot more impressive record than he gets credit for. So I stipulate that you're correct on that. But here's my answer to you. I think if you look at the culture of these two political parties, and I think of my own party, the Democratic Party, you scratch a Democrat and you're likely to find someone who came of age during the anti-war movement, or they have been a labor organizer, or they have been a community organizer of some sort, or they were active in the feminist movement, helping build that and coming up, or they were an environmental activist. They are basically people who are very good at being on the ground and getting people working together and getting things done in communities. You scratch a Republican, and you're much more likely to find someone who's got a background in corporate communications, marketing, advertising, in broad-scale communications. They are more adept and facile at crafting, delivering messages, and, by the way, far more disciplined. Now, they're a more homogenous party. They don't have all the coalition elements that we've got in the Democratic Party, but it's hard for us to stay on one message and speak with one voice, because we are composed of many different parts with many different agendas. So we've got different parts of our Democratic coalition speaking to their issue, but not speaking to a larger aggregated message that gets out there. So I think it's frankly a difference in culture and how we have developed. Now, we are better at organizing than Republicans are. We've been better at using technology to identify and deliver messages to voters. The Republicans caught up a little bit in this election. But we have always lagged behind them when it comes to the visual aspects of broad-scale, broad messaging, campaign communications.
Aren't the three types of candidates that you spoke about on the Republican side earlier an illustration of the perhaps emerging or the Republicans having to struggle with at least some part of that same problem?
Yeah, well, their real problem is they don't reflect the reality of what is America today. We are becoming in many states we can see in the future where we will be majority-minority countries. California is arguably there already. The rise of the Hispanic voter as a critical element in so many states changes states that, are in play now nationally that never were in play before. Georgia, North Carolina, not just Arizona, Nevada, but, other places. That's the story of Colorado, why it's a competitive state. So there's a younger, more cosmopolitan, in some cases more urban, certainly much more diverse ethnically and racially. And that coalition, which is, rightfully called the Obama coalition, is one that really reflects the trajectory of where the electorate's going in the future. The Republicans are wedded to a set of policies and people that will take them to the minority in national elections for president. Unfortunately for Democrats, it is a strategy because of the complexion of congressional districts that guarantees that they will likely have the majority in the House of Representatives until well into the 2020s. So, by the way, another question from Mrs. Clinton: why get elected, come back down to Washington, and have to deal with Speaker Boehner day in and day out? I mean, because that's what the reality would be for her. And could she create a different dynamic working with the Republican leadership of Congress than the one that's existed between President Obama and Speaker Boehner and now Majority Leader McConnell? So, I mean, that's a big question. In the end of the day, it's about these kind of personal relationships and how they work and how people build relationships of trust. When we read all these great biographies that have come out about people like Lyndon Johnson, you know how much the cloakroom politics and the backslapping and the ability to really connect with people, how important that is. And that's not one in which, if I were a university professor, I would give Mr. Obama passing grades at.
Last question we'll take from a student. Is there a last question from a student? No?
In the back.
Yes, back there, sorry. That's a good final question.
Yeah, it is,
Gives you an opportunity. The question is basically, especially for the younger generation, are they going to inherit a sort of permanent divisive politics, or is there a prospect for a change? And what might bring that about?
What a great way to end, because at the end of the day, I remain very hopeful. And part of it is because I see this generational change taking place in our politics. Frankly, we, the baby boomers, have been more wedded to the politics of division, wedge politics, the bitterness that has crept into our politics. We've thrived on that, used that. That's been our vernacular in politics. When I look at young people, like the students that we've met with today, or my own kids who are college students, they are much less frozen ideologically, much less partisan. They don't necessarily buy it, even if they're Democrats or Republicans, they don't necessarily buy everything their party forces down their throat. They are very pragmatic in looking for, they want to know what works and why does it work. And they are far more willing to work with people who come from different walks of life. They're more tolerant of diversity. They're more willing to kind of set aside whatever political differences might be there in the name of doing some project that's important in a community or something that they're working on together to get something done. So I see that as being the dominant thread of our politics going forward. I think they will inherit, a kinder, gentler type of vocabulary as to their own preferences in communication. They like more authenticity. They spot BS a mile away, and they won't tolerate it, particularly among politicians. So I think that will be forcing in time, if they step up and take the role in politics that they need to, by voting, by running for office, by being engaged, that will in due course change the tempo and tone of our national politics. Very much for the better, and that is very much a positive note to end on tonight.
Now, please, let's thank our speaker tonight, Mike McCurry, coming to the University of Delaware.